Hello there, I'm Dr. Doug Campbell, and it's time for a bit of the old Camellia sinensis, aka tea. It's hard to imagine English culture without tea. It has become such an important part of what it means to be English. Obviously, however, tea is not indigenous to the island of Britain. It comes from the other side of the world. So how did this commodity from Asia become such a cultural obsession for the English nation? The answer to that is inextricably intertwined with the story of the English East India Company. It's a history that straddles the nexus of the dawn of the capitalist age and the beginning of the British Empire. It involves low-down dirty theft and plunder, devious drug dealing, and even genocide. And the upshot of this sordid narrative is the question of whether the English East India Company was merely an innovative business enterprise empowered by the British Crown for the honor of England to advance trade, or whether the English East India Company was just BS. Let's find out. There, that's a bit more comfortable, but still got my tea. So this English East India Company started off relatively small. It was chartered in 1599, one of the first joint stock companies in Western history, with some 200 investors. Ultimately, it would grow to be one of the single most important entities in the economy of the entire vast British Empire. The company would have its own private army that was larger than the British Army at the time, and one way or another would have a say in the lives of more than half of the world's population. As a joint stock corporation, what that means is the company itself did not have sufficient resources to fund the beginning of its business activities, so it asked for investors to purchase shares in the company, with the idea that they risk some of their wealth up front, but that entitles them to a share of the company's profits down the line. Obviously, that's pretty much how the global economy works in the 21st century, but it was a pretty new idea at the time. So in some ways, the English East India Company kind of was the archetypical international capitalist corporation. As we said, though, it started off small. What it did have going for it, though, was that the Queen of England, Elizabeth I, granted it an official monopoly on all British trade with Asia, which is a pretty advantageous way to go.
So I got that going for me, which is nice.
Initially, the company was interested in obtaining spices.
He who controls the spice controls the universe.
And stuff like indigo, eventually raw cotton, silks, stuff like that. So trading with the Indies, but certainly from the very beginning, the Indian subcontinent was one of the places that the company's directors were very interested in. They established a presence on the Indian coast, developed relationships with some of the local Indian rulers to set up what they termed factories, which were not sites of production, but essentially warehouses and hubs of trade, to gain access to all of these very valuable Asian commodities that could be sold at an enormous profit back home in Britain. Initially, the English East India Company was simply there to trade, but by the early 1700s, they began to insert themselves into an ongoing civil war between the Mughal dynasty on the one hand, which had governed most of India for the past several centuries, which was predominantly Islamic in ideology, and a coalition of Hindu magnates and local rulers called the Marathas. As this civil war dragged on decade after decade, the directors of the East India Company saw an opportunity to exert more and more control over portions of India to advance their own economic interests and also those of the British Empire as a whole. The central figure in a lot of this was a dude named Robert Clive, one of the more notorious scumbags of 18th century British history, who served as the director of the company during the 1740s and 1750s, and who was absolutely ruthless when it came to seizing control of territory and pillaging it for the company. Company forces scored a resounding victory over the Mughal military, and in 1765 imposed the Treaty of Allahabad, which is often described as the beginning of the British Empire in India. In addition to establishing the East India Company's control over the entire province of Bengal, which was a vast chunk of territory in eastern India, bigger than Britain itself. Along with that came rights to tax and administer that territory, and Clive and the company simply seized resources as well. If you convert the 18th century values into 21st century dollars, the company seized about $310 million worth of wealth as a result of the treaty, and that includes about $30 million for Clive personally.
Greed, for lack of a better word, is good. Greed is right. Greed works. Greed clarifies, cuts through, and captures the essence of the evolutionary spirit.
Not only was the company simply seizing territory, but it was also modifying the way power relationships and economic networks functioned in India for England's advantage. This is the beginning of the process of the deindustrialization of India, which would take the better part of a century. It is one of the ironies of history that this is the dawn of the Industrial Revolution in Britain. That starts in the 1760s. In order to make some of that happen, though, they had to uproot and destroy some of the industries that had previously developed in India. At this point, India led the globe when it came to textiles production. They produced more cotton textiles, higher quality cotton textiles. That, of course, was the industry that was the focal point of the British Industrial Revolution, so they didn't want the competition. You can see some of the devastating impact of company economic policies with the Great Bengal Famine of 1769 to 1770, over the course of which some 10 million Bengalis died. And, it's possible to look at this and say, well, famines are awful, but they are natural phenomena. And that's true to a certain extent. Some of this was triggered by climate fluctuation, bad harvest, stuff like that. But if you look at most famines historically, they are not merely something that arises out of the natural world, but they represent a failure of those in power to deal with these new circumstances. And previously in Indian history, you had famines, but whoever had been ruling places like Bengal, whether it is the Mughals or Hindu Marathas or whatever, they had a system in place to deal with famines and to transfer food from places that had surplus to help deal with places where there were shortages. And people still died, sometimes a lot of people, but it had a tendency to kind of blunt the worst of it. Here, however, since the company had already dramatically disrupted the way the local economy worked, those networks no longer existed. Some of the local agriculture, too, was being shifted away from grain production to opium. More on that in a moment, which obviously you can't eat. And the company's taxes, even at the high point of the famine, continued to be levied. Company agents used violence and sometimes torture even to confiscate tax revenue from places that were already suffering from the famine. So you can make an argument, and plenty of scholars have, that what might have been a bad famine was made an order of magnitude worse by the policies of the English East India Company. Even with all of that, though, famine meant that the company's revenues were dipping in the 1770s. It wasn't as profitable as it previously had been. And the British government tried to help the company out. This is one of the things that led to the Tea Act of 1773, which granted the company a monopoly to trade tea to Britain's colonies wherever. And obviously, if you know anything about American history, this insistence that Britain's North American colonies buy tea from the English East India Company was one of the things that exacerbated the tensions leading up to the American Revolution. So you can see, I mean, this has globe-trotting implications. Closer to home, though, even that didn't do it. And rather than let the company go bankrupt, the British Parliament bailed it out. And if that sounds a little bit familiar, like, oh, too big to fail. A company has made some lousy business decisions and now needs the taxpayers to keep them from going under. I mean, that's not just a 21st century thing. One of the first great capitalist corporations had exactly that same thing happen. And this was not solely disinterested as well. In the 1770s, about a quarter of the members of the British Parliament were also shareholders in the company. So if they didn't use British taxpayer revenue to help out the company, they would lose their investment. It illustrates some of the difficulties with corporations like this that operate hand in glove with representative government and serve as a corrupting force. We've just mentioned both tea and opium, which became very important parts of the company's economic portfolio. Tea Europeans had known about for a while. It came from China. It was not grown in India at this point. And during the 1600s, it had been kind of an upper class fad in Britain. By the time you got into the 1700s, though, tea prices dropped and it became increasingly popular. By the middle part of the century, Britain was importing some 6 million pounds of tea from China, and it was being consumed by all classes of British society. This was really where tea became part of the fabric of everyday life in England. There was a lot of demand on the part of the European powers to trade with China. There were all sorts of things, silks, porcelain, tea, obviously, that you could only get from China. The problem was that from the perspective of the Chinese government, there wasn't really anything that the European white guys had that China needed. And so they were willing grudgingly to allow a certain amount of limited trade, but only at one port in Canton, under very disadvantageous trade conditions. They only accepted essentially gold and silver bullion for any of their commodities. And the fact that all of these European traders could still make a profit under those conditions is a testimony to how valuable a lot of these Chinese commodities were back home in Europe. Unsurprisingly, the English East India Company is at the forefront of England's involvement in trade, not just with India, but also with China. They're the ones that are supervising a lot of this tea that is funneling from China back home to Britain. And they're looking for it would be great if we could find something that the Chinese wanted, that there was a market for, so we wouldn't have our precious metals kind of sucked out of the English economy and flow into the coffers in China. And wouldn't you know it, tea didn't grow in India, but opium did, particularly in Bengal, in the part that was controlled by the English East India Company. So they began smuggling opium into China. They started small at first in the 1700s, but by the 1830s, the company was smuggling some 5.6 million pounds of opium into China. They had gone into the drug trade on a massive scale. And if you're unfamiliar with opium, it is essentially a narcotic, the same chemical that makes morphine or heroin or oxycodone or any of the other quote-unquote opiates. That's where that word comes from. So addictive. When you have a customer in China for opium, you've got a customer.
We should take a little taste so we know how much to cut. It's business. Fair enough.
you've got millions of drug addicts with all of the problems that brings with it. Crime, violence, theft, corruption, all of that. Eventually, the Chinese government, which had been bribed to look the other way on the local level, felt they needed to intervene with this. A new Chinese imperial commissioner was appointed to the city of Canton in 1839 and proceeded to confiscate at gunpoint all of the opium in all of the East India Company warehouses, and some other countries were also involved. The French, the Americans had also participated in the opium trade in China and proceeded to destroy it all and then deliver a very haughty letter to the British Queen Victoria, admonishing her for allowing her subjects to be complicit in the poisoning of the people of China. The Industrial Revolution had had enough of an impact on the development of not merely economic technology, but military technology, that the British, who when they first started showing up in China, were very much the junior partner, the inferior party in the trade relationship, who had to come hat in hand begging for whatever they could get. What ensued, one of my favorite wars in all of history, the so-called Opium War from 1839 to 1842, where the British Empire went to war over the English East India Company's right to deal dope to China. And they crushed China. China was absolutely humiliated, and in the aftermath, a brutal treaty was imposed. The Treaty of Nanjing, which opened China up to more trade, which ceded the port of Hong Kong to the British Empire, and which most humiliatingly actually forced the Chinese government to compensate British merchants and the East India Company for all of that opium that they had destroyed. The company had one more role to play. In 1848, they sponsored a Scottish botanist by the name of Robert Fortune to disguise himself as a Chinese mandarin and steal samples of tea plants to take back to India so that Britain could begin growing its own tea, cutting the Chinese empire out of the tea trade that they had invented. Recommended readings for a very detailed history of how the English East India Company began to rule large parts of India. William Dalrymple's The Anarchy, The Relentless Rise of the East India Company from 2019 does an admirable job of describing that. For a bit more on the company's role in the opium trade in China, Julia Lovell's The Opium War, Drugs, Dreams, and the Making of China from 2014 is a very readable popular history on that. For tea in general, Sarah Rose's For All the Tea in China, How England Stole the World's Favorite Drink and Changed History from 2010 would be your go-to. And finally, for some descriptions of the role of the British Empire in exacerbating famines which killed millions of people, Mike Davis's Late Victorian Holocausts, El Niño Famines and the Making of the Third World, doesn't deal so much with the Bengal famine that we talked about, but deals with a couple of El Niño related famines in the late 19th century. And it in some ways is something of a tendentious book. He is a scholar, but also a sharp critic of contemporary capitalism, and makes a pretty profound argument that corporate interests helped make those famines way worse than they needed to be, and resulted in the unnecessary deaths of millions of people throughout Asia. So for the verdict, clearly the English East India Company is one of the most important single entities in all of modern history that had a huge impact all over the world. But that in and of itself illustrates that any attempt to simply portray the English East India Company as just a plucky little business enterprise is simply BS. It was so much more than that. It was the fist of the British Empire in Asia. It had a private army. It was a government in its own right. It was an international drug cartel. It was super important. So there you go. Always check your sources and evidence. Bye.